This video is part of the Reaching Students with Disabilities Symposium series.
Our next speaker is Joe Seski, who started us up in the morning as the second speaker, and he is talking about accommodating students who are deaf or hard of hearing in the lab. Joe's from the Northeast ADA Center. Sure.
Thank you, because I think we took our controller, so.
That works for me.
Thank you very much. Should I use the handheld or the lavalier?
Sorry?
Should I use the handheld or the lavalier?
The lavalier's right there, if you like that.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Stick this.
Yeah, a second. Here we go. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, again. Thanks for being patient there for a minute. And again, let me echo what everyone else has been saying so far today, too, about thanking Pat and ACS for putting together this symposium. As I've been in the audience and listening to the different speakers, you really have had a wonderful cross-section of different speakers to talk about disability related issues. And it occurred to me that I'm sort of, in some ways, an outlier in the speakers here, because I'm coming from a very different perspective. I'm not someone who is a professional in the chemistry field. I'm someone whose work primarily is in disability rights. And so when I'm approaching a question, sometimes I look at things in a little different perspective because of the lens that I use for what I do. And I realized it's something I don't think I really did this morning. And if we can go to slide 2, Pat. I didn't really explain what my center was and what I do. And let me just take one brief minute to explain that so people have a better understanding of where I'm coming from and sort of our background. I mentioned, and Pat has mentioned, I work with the Northeast ADA Center. What that center does, it provides training and technical assistance as well as research on the Americans with Disabilities Act and other disability-related laws. We work with individuals. We provide a technical assistance line. We work with individuals, with government agencies, with nonprofits and business about different disability issues and concerns. We answer questions, and then if people have a training request, we come and do trainings for them. And over the years, I've had an opportunity both to work with colleagues who were deaf or hard of hearing, or work in training situations where people had questions, or perhaps participants were deaf or hard of hearing. And so I wanted to touch a little bit on that experience today. In terms of the human aspect, it's really run throughout what we've talked about, but I want to highlight it a little bit in the lens of what I'm going to be talking about today. So that's number 3, please. So, as you've heard from the speakers and listening to their stories as well as their presentations, obviously, people who have what you might term the same general category of disability have very different experiences of that disability. And it can affect them, their disability, it affects them in very different ways. That's true, of course, as well for people who have hearing-related disabilities. There are some people who have what might be termed mild hearing impairment. You have other individuals who are classified as having a severe impairment. Other people have a more profound impairment of hearing loss. And that spectrum, within that spectrum of the amount of sound that someone is able to hear, there's also a factor to consider that someone's ability to hear can also depend on frequency and the range of a sound. So someone may have difficulty with speech and hearing speech and understanding it, while another person may be able to hear speech, but if things are in a certain registry, whether a very high frequency or perhaps a lower frequency, maybe then they have a difficulty hearing it. So you have this wide range, and that's true for all disabilities, even if the category, quote unquote, might be the same. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we finish up the day here. You also have people who have very different experiences of their disability, and there's of course a whole host of factors why that might be. One thing that can contribute to that, one element, is when someone had their disability. For some people, and this is true with hearing-related disabilities, of course, some people are born with their disability, and other people acquire it at different stages in life. Of course, we've heard just in the afternoon session a gamut of people who have acquired disabilities at different points in their life. For example, mine was very young. I was only 3, but for all intents and purposes, I might as well have been born with my disability in terms of my experience. Where Lee, who was shared his experience, was older than that, and Diane, was younger, sort of in the middle. So there you have a wide range of when someone acquires their disability, and that can impact how they understand their disability, how they want and choose to communicate about it, as well. And there are of course other factors too that you have to look at that are more wide-ranging in terms of how someone understands disability as part of their own identity, and that is particularly true when it comes to hearing-related disabilities, as I'll get to in just a moment. So with hearing-related disabilities, you have people who have adopted their own strategies for managing or incorporating their disabilities into how they function. You saw me put up this morning the definition of disability under the ADA, and now in the, if you will, the disability-related field, that's sort of seen as a little bit older model of disability. They call it a functional model of disability, where the sort of more current theories or understandings of disability see it as more of a societal issue. But with a functional definition, like the ADA, it's easier to understand this concept, that people will adapt different strategies for accessing what they need to access in terms of communication and in terms of their environment. And so I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that people who are deaf or hard of hearing might use to gather information. Let's go to next slide, please. On this slide is really a very neat summation of what I was talking about. And for those of you who may have difficulty reading the text, I will read this particular slide. It comes from the National Association of the Deaf. And it says, there are variations in how a person becomes deaf or hard of hearing, level of hearing, age of onset, functional background, communication methods, and cultural identity. I wanted to stop particularly on that last point because it's one that I've just started to hint at a little bit, but didn't explore in great detail. Within the, if you will, a community of disability advocates, if you look at in broad, very broad terms, what you may call disability community. As I said, there are a number of different perspectives, and people incorporate their disability to greater or lesser extents into their identity. In the in this area of disability, hearing-related disabilities, you have one of the stronger examples of that in terms of people who are deaf and were born or have become incorporated into what might be called deaf culture. And a lot of times you'll see deaf capitalized with a D because it can often be understood by people in that community as being its own culture, has its own language, its own style, method of communication. And so with that being the case, it's important as faculty, as colleagues, and as other people just who are interested in general to understand that while we're talking about communication in my presentation here and accommodation strategies, part of being effective in helping people to develop different tools and techniques for pursuing their studies is having a cultural competency. I think someone actually mentioned that this morning. I forget if it was Mona or maybe Missy, but we talked about the idea of cultural competency also as a professor, as a teacher. It's very important to understand it. And while, yes, it may not directly impact the education process in the most literal sense, it's important for all of us who are in the education field to be aware that there are things such as a culture, particularly around deafness. Often individuals who are deaf may not regard their impairment as a disability, particularly for those who grew up with no hearing. It is simply a part of everyday life, and it's not seen as particular disadvantage. And there's a lot of information out there if you want to read about it, about the cultural understanding of deafness. But be aware that when you are working with students with disabilities, it's important to come to understand everyone's perspective. And it may be quite different than what you're familiar with. Let's go to number 5, please. And that's what I wanted to hit on here on this slide. Respectful communication is not a quote unquote accommodation in itself, but in terms of a strategy of creating a professional, effective, collegial relationship, it's important. And part of being respectful in terms of working with a student or another colleague with a disability is doing at least some basic investigation into what disability is, what it can mean to different people, and if the opportunity presents itself, to talk with the student, the colleague, about their disability and being comfortable in doing that, because what your expectation may be could be very different from what the reality is. And in trainings that I do in a very different context, when I'm talking with employers or businesses about either working with other employees or colleagues or customers with disabilities, I talk about taking the approach of empathy versus sympathy. And they're very different. When you come from a sympathetic approach, it's more paternalistic, where you're trying to feel, you're imagining what it must be like to have your type of disability, what your experience must be. And honestly, that can lead to a lot of counterproductive things and things that can creep in and make the collegial relationship more difficult. It can also lead to those lowered expectations. Instead of asking, like we were just saying before I started, instead of asking how, you may get back to imagining, because you can't imagine how to work around something. Is it even possible? Very different point. Where with an empathetic approach, you're looking at understanding, trying to understand what the individual's perspective is, not how you would manage it, not how you would incorporate it. And again, typically I don't have a forum to sort of talk about this with educators, but since I've spoken to a number of people on the break and hearing other people speak and the important messages that they shared, I just wanted to reemphasize that point as well. Getting back to more of the basics, if you will, in this, obviously, depending on the information that's being shared, it's going to impact how you deliver it. Under the ADA, you heard me mention something called effective communication this morning. That's the principle that people with different disabilities have an equal right to have the same amount of access to communication as those without disabilities. And when you're looking at effective communication, you look at some key points: length, complexity, and the nature of the communication. Now, when you bring that idea here into the classroom, it's the same thing. When you're looking for strategies for accommodations, for serving and working with students with hearing-related disabilities, the right method of communication, the right tool, will depend on what's being communicated and what the interaction involved is like. As part of that process, if you're able to, it's wonderful to engage the student, and you should. If the student is comfortable, if they've approached you, I've talked to some people here who I use the term Office for Students with Disabilities. You've heard other terms for the same thing today, DRC, that Hobie was mentioning. SAO is another one. But essentially, an office that coordinates the services that are needed for students with disabilities. Sometimes, as professionals, you're not, those in your college level, you're not given information about what a student's disability is. And so your hands might be a little bit tied. Now, depending on the accommodation and what it is, you may have a clue. You know, if someone has a sign language interpreter, well, it's a pretty safe bet. At the very least, it's someone who has a hearing disability using ASL, American Sign Language. Other times, you're not going to be sure. But if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to engage the student and at least engage the Office for Students with Disabilities to talk about what's the right kind of method of communication for someone with the particular disability involved, in this case, a hearing-related disability. We'll go to the next slide. So with that, I wanted to talk about some different situations, some different types of communication. I want to talk about the communication between professor or teacher and student. Then I want to talk about communication within a group setting for peer-to-peer communication. And then I will follow up finally with some suggestions for the laboratory setting, some adaptations that might make things more successful or easier for a student with a hearing-related disability. First, as I mentioned, with effective communication, depends on the complexity, the length, and nature of the communication. So let's look at some hypothetical situations here. Let's say someone is able to hear, but they have a type of hearing that primarily affects their ability to understand speech. And they may have adopted various strategies for managing it. And here are some couple solutions you might look into or you might consider. One, you heard Hobie talk earlier about meeting with a lab partner before class to go over things, providing printed instructions or materials, notes from the teacher. That's going to be one communication tool that you can obviously rely on and use. From a technological point of view, is everyone familiar with CART? Yes, or well, some have something, some may not. CART is a technology by which essentially a real-time transcription is provided on a computer screen. CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time. That is more a translation. That's more of a technological solution that someone may have. And that would be appropriate for like a lecture style where it's a large group. You'll have maybe some interaction, but it'll be much less than you might in a small group setting or certainly on a one-on-one situation. You may have some people who have difficulty hearing, but perhaps are able to lip read and use that as their coping strategy. And lip reading would lead to a couple things that a teacher might have to consider. One, positioning, making sure that the student is able to see, obviously, that your mouth, that you're speaking. You can't obviously hold things in your hand that might obscure your mouth, block their vision. Also, in general, with communication, I think a lot of times we forget how much we communicate more than just with words, but with our expressions and with our other gestures. Very important within the community for people who have hearing related, and particularly for people who are deaf, that someone is able to have a good view of the professor, because not only what we're saying, but how we're saying it often will convey the import of what we're saying and what it means. So obviously, if you have someone who's relying on sight to do a lot of their communicating, providing preferential seating could be a modification that might be expected of an institution. So that's one tool. Also, in terms of technology, it's up there, assistive listening systems. There are different types, and depending if it's more of a lecture hall setting, that may be appropriate. That is a technology solution that can, either through tying into someone's hearing aids, if they use hearing aids, it can magnify the speech being spoken into like a mic, so that individual who perhaps has more severe hearing loss, their hearing aid will be able to receive that and amplify it. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, oh my goodness. All right, I'll speed up. With interpreting, a couple things to keep in mind. Some are from the ADA, some are just common sense things. With the ADA, an interpreter, using American Sign Language most likely, in the classroom as a communication aid, the interpreter must know the technical language and terms that are involved. So if you, depending on your role at a school, make sure that the interpreter knows the language that you're using in chemistry. Obviously, you were very specific and very specialized vocabulary at some points. The school needs to make sure that the interpreter is competent to translate that information. If you're a professor, you may want to meet with the interpreter beforehand to discuss the day's information so that they're more prepared to present. And also, the student may want to meet with them as well to make sure that they're on the same page and that they will have a clear view of the interpreter. One thing that is a little tip down the bottom there of the slide is that if a demonstration is being done, be sure to leave gaps where the interpreter will pause, and then a student who is watching will also be able to watch the experiment as well as the interpreter themselves. Key point. Also, one quick thing, and then I'll go to the next slide, Pat, and I'll finish up. Thanks. With interpreters, just as an etiquette point, remember, though it's a person, in this context, an interpreter is a tool. So if you're asking a question of the student, address it to the student, not to the interpreter. Even though it might be a force of habit to talk to someone who is verbally responding, proper etiquette is to address the person. So here we're talking about group settings. Obviously, we already talked about body positioning for a professor, also true in a small group setting. Simple things like sticking to turn taking. I know it sounds ridiculously simple, but it's important in terms of someone trying to follow the communication. And it also generally helps promote better interaction when people actually listen to each other, which can get off track sometimes in small groups. On a one-on-one setting, sometimes simple solutions might work best, and you see some examples up there with texting or using a computer. There are different tools that you can use, some that are just, if you will, off-the-shelf, part of regular everyday use. And let's go to the next one. And with this is just the laboratory setting. Again, just communicating information in different ways. If there are alerts, alarms, make sure or try to make sure that there are visual ones so that, again, it's not only an auditory signal being communicated, it's also a visual one. Posting safety information, making sure that the interpreter as well as the student knows the procedures is important. And again, it will improve safety for everyone involved. And just reducing general clutter is also important so that someone who is relying more on vision rather than hearing will be able to see what's happening in the lab more effectively, whether that's using transparent hoods or just rearranging or having equipment arranged so that there are better sight lines for the student. Do we have time for a quick question? We'll sort of rush to the end here with quick questions. Any quick questions that people may have
I was just wondering, do you know of any resources that either your center or nationally ADA provides with um, resources as far as, especially laboratory, because that's my area. For example, you mentioned making things more visual alerts rather than auditory. Is there places where we can find like a list of things that would assist in that? For example, I
Mhm.
know one of the things is if an alarm's going off, obviously you can't hear it, probably a flashing light. So
Right.
most hoods don't have that. It's just an
Right.
auditory alarm. So things along those lines.
Uh, for some of that, yes, I have information. Email me, and I will email you resources. That's probably the shortest, simple thing to do. But yes, there are some tools. We don't have a lot because it's a very specialized area. Obviously, the laboratory setting, um, and I do have some though, based on work I've done for the book. That I worked, the chapter I worked on with Hobie was on both sensory disabilities. So I'm glad to share with you what I have. Sure.